James Van Der Beek was the face of one of television's most iconic shows, a series watched by millions, replayed for decades, and still streamed around the world today. But according to his own words, he saw almost nothing from it. No steady residual income, no long-term financial safety. And years later, when his family faced their most difficult chapter, fans were left asking the same quiet question. How can someone who starred in such a massive hit end up without the financial security everyone assumed he had? The answer isn't simple, and it reveals something most viewers never see behind the scenes of their favorite shows. The moment that reshaped everything didn't happen during filming. It happened years later in an interview that at the time didn't seem unusual. James Van Der Beek calmly explained something that surprised almost everyone listening. There was no residual money, he said. I saw almost nothing from that. No drama, no anger, just a simple statement of reality. And yet, it directly contradicted what millions of fans believed, because from the outside, Dawson's Creek looked like the definition of success. The show premiered in 1998 and quickly became a defining part of its era. It introduced characters that felt real, emotional, and relatable. It ran for 6 seasons. It reached global audiences. And long after it ended, it continued finding new viewers through reruns, digital platforms, and streaming services. Which raises a natural question. If the show kept earning, why didn't its lead actor benefit the same way? To understand that, you have to go back to the very beginning. James was only 20 years old when he signed his original contract. At that age, very few actors fully understand the long-term impact of contract structures. And at that time, the television industry worked very differently than it does today. Most actors, especially young ones early in their careers, don't negotiate from a position of power. They're negotiating from a position of opportunity. And opportunity can sometimes come with hidden trade-offs. Because in television, the biggest money isn't always the initial paycheck. It's the residuals. Residuals are ongoing payments actors receive when a show continues airing, gets syndicated, or is licensed to new platforms. In theory, they allow actors to share in the long-term success of the projects they helped create. But in practice, it depends entirely on the contract and the network. And Dawson's Creek aired on the WB network. At the time, the WB was not one of the traditional big 3 networks like ABC, CBS, or NBC. According to publicly discussed industry practices, shows on smaller or newer networks often had different financial structures, and that difference could affect long-term residual payments significantly, meaning a show could be culturally massive, but financially structured in a way that didn't guarantee the same long-term returns for everyone involved. And this wasn't something fans knew, because from the outside, success looks permanent. But inside the industry, success can be temporary, and that temporary success created a turning point in James's life that most people never noticed. Years after Dawson's Creek ended, the financial momentum slowed down. Not overnight, but gradually. He later explained that when the original money from the show ran out, he had to make a decision. He couldn't just wait for opportunities. He had to actively rebuild. So he took new roles, television shows, films, guest appearances. Each project wasn't just a creative decision, it was a practical one. Because behind the scenes, he wasn't just an actor anymore. He was a provider. And that shift from rising star to working actor is something many people don't realize happens more often than they think. Fame doesn't always guarantee stability, and stability doesn't always last forever. But the biggest shift in the industry was still ahead. Because while Dawson's Creek continued reaching new audiences, the entire business model of television was quietly changing. Streaming. At first, it seemed like a massive opportunity. Shows could live forever, reach global audiences instantly, stay relevant for decades. But according to many actors and public statements during industry negotiations, the financial structure behind streaming worked very differently from traditional syndication. Residual payments became smaller, less predictable, and in some cases, nearly non-existent compared to older models, which created a strange paradox. Shows were being watched more than ever, but the actors weren't necessarily earning more from that continued success. And James Van Der Beek himself publicly spoke about this shift years later. He explained that residuals had all but disappeared in the streaming era. Not because the shows weren't successful, but because the system had changed. And for many actors, especially those whose biggest projects happened before streaming became dominant, that change had long-term consequences, consequences that fans couldn't see. Until suddenly they could. Because when his family later faced overwhelming medical and personal challenges, the assumption of financial security didn't match reality. And that's when the public finally began to understand something that had been invisible for decades. Television success doesn't always equal lifetime financial protection, even for the lead star. But that realization leads to an even deeper question: if Dawson's Creek was still being watched, if new viewers were discovering it every year, if streaming platforms were continuing to benefit from its popularity, then where did all that value go? And why was the system built this way in the first place? To understand where the value went, you have to understand how television contracts were designed in the late 1990s. At that time, streaming didn't exist. There was no global digital distribution model, no endless replay culture, no expectation that a show would live forever online. Most contracts were written around one assumption: a show would air, finish, and eventually fade. Residuals existed, but they were based on a completely different ecosystem: reruns on traditional television, physical media sales, and limited syndication deals. No one anticipated what would happen next, because the internet didn't just change how people watched television, it changed how long television could last. Suddenly, shows weren't limited to their original broadcast window. They became permanent, accessible anytime, anywhere, to anyone. And Dawson's Creek was one of those shows that found new life. New generations discovered it through streaming platforms. Clips circulated online, scenes resurfaced across social media. The show never truly disappeared, which logically should have meant continued financial rewards for those who helped create it. But contracts don't automatically update when technology evolves. They remain fixed unless renegotiated. And renegotiation isn't always possible, especially years later, especially when the original agreements were signed under completely different assumptions. This created a quiet divide in the entertainment industry. On one side, platforms and networks benefiting from decades-long access to content. On the other, actors whose compensation was largely tied to the original era. And James Van Der Beek wasn't alone in this experience. Many actors from that generation publicly shared similar stories. Some revealed that residual checks from streaming were surprisingly small. Others explained that the structure didn't reflect modern viewership levels, not because anyone broke the rules, but because the rules were written before the future arrived. And that future arrived faster than anyone expected. This issue became widely discussed during the SAG-AFTRA strike, when actors and writers advocated for updated compensation models that reflected the realities of streaming. James himself voiced support for those efforts. He explained that residuals weren't just a bonus, they were stability. They were rent, groceries, education, healthcare. They were the difference between short-term success and long-term security. And that brings us to another layer most fans never see: healthcare. In the entertainment industry, health insurance for actors is often tied to specific eligibility requirements, income thresholds, or a certain number of working days within a defined period. According to publicly available union guidelines, actors must meet these thresholds to qualify for continued coverage. If they don't meet them, coverage can change or end. This system was designed to support active working actors, but the nature of acting is unpredictable. Even successful actors can experience gaps between projects, and those gaps can have real-world consequences, especially during serious health challenges, which makes one detail even more important. James didn't stop working. According to publicly available information, he continued appearing in films and television projects even after his diagnosis in 2023. He kept moving forward, kept creating, kept showing up. Because in this industry, momentum matters. But even momentum doesn't erase structural realities, and structural realities don't always match public perception, because to fans, he was still Dawson Leary. Still the face of a generation. Still part of a show that never stopped existing. But financially, the situation was more complicated. And when news of his passing was shared publicly, something unexpected happened. The response wasn't just emotional, it was immediate. Friends, colleagues, and supporters helped organize a fundraiser to support his family. Within 24 hours, it raised over $1 million. Not because people believed he wasn't successful, but because people realized success doesn't always work the way they imagined. It was a reminder of something deeply human. Behind every iconic role is a real person with responsibilities, with family, with challenges, and the public response revealed something else too. Fans weren't just supporting his legacy, they were supporting his reality. But this moment also sparked a broader conversation, one that extended far beyond a single actor. Because James Van Der Beek's story wasn't just about one contract. It was about an entire generation of actors who built the foundation of modern television, before the modern system existed. And that raises a powerful question. What happens when the industry evolves, but the agreements stay the same? The truth is, the entertainment industry has always been built on timing, not just talent, not just opportunity. Timing, being in the right place at the right moment, under the right system. James Van Der Beek entered television during a transitional era, when network TV still dominated, but the digital future was already forming in the background. No one knew exactly what that future would look like, and no one fully understood how valuable long-term digital distribution would become, because at the time, success was measured differently. It was measured in ratings, in weekly viewership numbers, in magazine covers, interviews, public recognition, not in lifetime streaming hours across dozens of platforms worldwide. That metric didn't exist yet, so contracts weren't built around it. And this created one of the most important but invisible gaps in modern entertainment, a gap between cultural value and contractual value. Because culturally, Dawson's Creek never stopped mattering. It remained part of television history. Clips resurfaced online. Scenes became reference points. Entire new audiences discovered it years after the final episode aired. But contractually, the terms stayed frozen in time. And frozen contracts don't adapt. They don't grow with popularity. They don't expand with global reach. They remain exactly as they were written. Which means the long-term outcome isn't determined by how successful a show becomes later. It's determined by how it was structured at the beginning. And for young actors signing their first major roles, that beginning often happens before they fully understand the long-term implications. Not because of mistakes, but because of momentum. Because when opportunity arrives early, the priority isn't always long-term negotiation. The priority is stepping through the door. And James stepped through that door. He became a household name. He built a career that spanned decades. He appeared in films, television series, independent projects, and creative collaborations. He remained connected to his craft. But he also became something else, a symbol of a larger reality within the entertainment industry, a reality that many actors quietly experience, where fame and financial stability don't always move in perfect alignment, where visibility doesn't always guarantee long-term security, where the public sees permanence. But the system operates on timelines, and timelines eventually change. Yet despite all of this, one thing never faded: his impact. Because impact isn't measured only in contracts, it's measured in memory, in the emotional connection audiences build with characters, in the moments that stay with people years after the screen fades to black. And Dawson Leary was one of those characters. For millions of viewers, he represented growing up, change, uncertainty, hope. He wasn't just part of a show. He was part of people's lives. And that kind of connection doesn't disappear. It evolves. It carries forward. And it shapes how people respond when reality becomes visible. Because when fans learned about the financial realities behind the scenes, their response wasn't driven by outrage. It was driven by understanding. Understanding that success isn't always linear. Understanding that systems evolve faster than agreements. Understanding that behind every iconic performance, there's a human story that continues long after the cameras stop rolling. And in many ways, that's the most important part of this entire story. Not the contracts, not the numbers, not even the industry itself, but the reminder that entertainment is built by people, people whose work can last forever, even when the systems around them change. James Van Der Beek's story reveals something deeper than financial structures or industry mechanics. It reveals how invisible the business side of entertainment can be, even when the creative side is seen by millions. It reminds us that the shows we love don't just exist as content, they exist as moments in time, created under specific rules, specific expectations, specific systems, and when those systems change, the outcomes don't always change with them. But his legacy was never defined by contracts. It was defined by connection, by the audiences who grew up watching him, by the stories that continued long after the final episode aired, and by the conversations that his experience helped bring into the light. Because now, the industry is changing again. Contracts are evolving, residual structures are being re-examined, and future actors may enter a system shaped by stories like his. Which raises one final question. How many other iconic performances exist today, whose real stories remain completely unseen? That's exactly what we're exploring in the next video. The hidden economics behind the world's most streamed shows and why streaming changed everything for actors forever.